Today we hear from award-winning filmmaker Chip Duncan, who has written, produced, and directed more than 40 long-form documentaries for international broadcasts. With distribution in more than 140 countries, his films have won more than 130 national and international awards and has been featured in numerous festivals and have appeared in primetime broadcasts on PBS, HBO, Sundance, and Discovery Networks. Chip is going to talk to us about his public television film, Tolkien and Lewis, Myth, Imagination, and the Quest for Meaning, which is slated to air nationwide later this year. We look forward to your presentation, Chip, and have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund, as well as giving you a copy of our centennial history. So thank you so much for speaking to us. Just a reminder that there'll be microphones that will be around circulating the area, so please wait for those for questions. So please welcome Chip Duncan.
Thank you very much. For those of you who may have been members in 2013, I did come to the Rotary in Madison at that time to speak about a TV series on Reagan's presidency. So I thank my friend Bill White here for inviting me back again. I figured if I didn't screw that one up too badly that I would get re-invited. And so I'm particularly grateful to this table here too. There's a lot of friends here, so I'm seeing some familiar faces. Thank you for being here. This film that I'm going to talk about today is quite different from the Reagan presidency. This is a film called Tolkien and Lewis, Myth, Imagination, and the Quest for Meaning. It started with an earlier documentary in 2002 that we did for PBS called The Magic Never Ends. And I'm going to just ask for a show of hands here. How many people in the audience are fans of C.S. Lewis? And how about JRR Tolkien? Okay, well, I'm just guessing that few of you may know this, but they happen to be great friends, and their lives coincided at Oxford. Both of them were Oxford professors. Tolkien was a professor dealing primarily with languages, and Lewis was primarily a professor of mythology. And they became close friends, and I didn't realize that when we were producing the first documentary on C.S. Lewis. I just kind of went in with my background information on Lewis. And I found Lewis to be a fascinating character, obviously went on to become one of the greatest Christian writers in the English language. Lewis published over 33 books, all are still in print. Tolkien, as many of you know, went on to publish The Lord of the Rings, which some people call a trilogy, some don't, but The Lord of the Rings, and several essays, and the Silmarillion. And Tolkien's books have sold over 150 million copies. When we did the first film, I probably underestimated Lewis's popularity. And our company, which specializes in doing long-form documentaries, I can tell you that at this point, the film on C.S. Lewis was by far the most successful film that we've ever done in terms of sales, downloads, DVDs, and I also wrote a companion book which did fairly well on Lewis's biography. But there was one thing about Lewis's journey that particularly intrigued me, and in the book I wrote and in the first film, they were small sections. In the book, it was probably one small chapter. In the film, it was maybe 2.5 minutes. And it had to do with one night in 1931 when Lewis decided to invite JRR Tolkien over to dinner. And he included his friend Hugo Dyson. And Lewis was a professor at that time living in the dorms at Magdalen College. I don't think the British call them dormitories, but it reminded me of Trip Hall. But anyway, he was living in the dorms, invited Tolkien and Dyson over for dinner. And they essentially came over thinking, we'll have a little dinner conversation, kind of like what the Inklings used to do, if you're familiar with the Inklings. And it was anticipated to be about a 2-hour dinner. And what happened was quite remarkable. It became an 8.5-hour dinner. And in the course of the evening, Tolkien, who was a Catholic at the time, and Dyson, who was also Catholic, convinced Lewis that Christianity was true. And they used the fundamental principles of their study of mythology to do it. Now, as an anecdote, in my first book and in the first film, that was just fine. Okay, this is the night when Lewis had his big faith conversion and went from being, at that point, a theist to being a Christian. And anecdotally, I think it's quite interesting. But the more I thought about it, I thought, you know, Lewis was known as an argumentative guy. He started the Socratic Club at Oxford. This is a guy who lived in fully the life of the mind, so nothing came easily to him. And if it took 8.5 hours for these guys to convince him, then that must mean that he was arguing against them for most of the evening. Otherwise, it would have been a short conversation. So I reached out for the second time in my life to the people at Wheaton College down near Chicago that housed the archives of C.S. Lewis and the archives of JRR Tolkien. And they had helped us with the first film. And I said, you know, this night really intrigues me. I think we might have a second film here. And I met with the people at Wheaton College. They agreed. And they opened up their archives to us for the second time. And we decided to kind of go down this to do a different Oxford guy, a rabbit hole, Lewis Carroll. So we decided to go down the rabbit hole and investigate this evening. And what we found was that Lewis had written about this night in a couple of his publications, most notably in a book called Surprised by Joy. And Tolkien had never written about it at all. We also know that Lewis went on to become a great Christian writer after this night, and virtually everything he wrote from that point on was Christian. And Tolkien, for the most part, never wrote anything Christian and didn't include much Christian imagery in his work of any kind. Scholars will debate that, but largely that's the case in Lord of the Rings. There's very little Christian mythology in Lord of the Rings. At any rate, the question became, what did these guys say to Lewis that convinced him? And so we set about the process of interviewing people from around the world who were notable either as Lewis scholars, Tolkien scholars, or scholars of mythology. And we wound up with people populating this film who represent a Hindu perspective, a Muslim perspective, a Christian perspective, an atheist perspective. And the idea behind the film is that when you get to the end of this film, hopefully we will have engaged the life of the mind in a way that is comprehensible, but also you will have a much better understanding of what mythology is, how the imaginative process works in terms of informing our rituals, and then in Lewis's case, why he drew the conclusion he drew, but also, if we did the film correctly, it allows you to draw whatever conclusion you want to draw. So it's not in any way a proselytizing or evangelical film. At the same time, it's very respective of Lewis's faith journey and really tells the story of how we come to our faiths through Lewis's point of view. So I'm going to show 2 clips today. The first one, I think we're ready for, and this is about 4 minutes. Okay, well, I'm sorry about the technical problems there. We'll see if we can resolve them for the next clip. But one of the things that the film gets at in a very direct way is what is mythology historically? And what we find is that historically mythology means truth, it means story. And we today come to equate it with falsehood. So one of the first things we do is we kind of turn the rhetoric around mythology upside down and give it a different perspective. And so for those of you who might, for example, be familiar with Joseph Campbell's work, we kind of follow a clear Joseph Campbell line throughout the film. We get very heavily into the imaginative process and look at how the imagination works and where our ideas come from. And there's one particularly controversial part of the film. I didn't think it would be, but it became controversial, which is what informs our faith? Does ritual come first or does story come first? And in particular, Reza Aslan, who some of you may know, is a kind of a lightning rod today, but Reza is a big part of the film, and he addresses that in a fairly significant way. And then, for me, I think one of the things that's probably the most interesting about the film is the relationship between nature and faith, and that comes out in a significant way. And it's written about extensively by Tolkien, and plays out pretty well in the film. So I'm going to play a second clip here. Hopefully it'll work all the way through, and then open the discussion up for questions. This one is also about 4 minutes long, and I think it includes a lot more interview subjects. We'll give you a little more depth into who's in the film. So for those of you who are fans of public television, you may remember The Power of Myth, which was a long series done by Bill Moyers that included Joseph Campbell. And we try and stay within kind of the Joseph Campbell world while looking at a particularly Christian topic. And so the odyssey of trying to get this on public TV has actually been quite interesting. I want to share the story with you. But when we did the C.S. Lewis film, it was a straightforward biography, intellectually fairly light, didn't require a lot from the viewer. And this film, when you watch it from start to finish, I worked on it, I wrote it, I did the interviews, and my head hurts every time I see this film, because it requires you to think on a very deep level, much the way Campbell did. And at the same time, because it does deal with the journey of a renowned Christian author, there's an element to it that I think some broadcasters might be a little bit afraid of. And so we submitted this film, even though we had great success with the C.S. Lewis film. When we submitted this one to PBS, they have a programming body that includes 3 people. There's very limited time slots on PBS, and only a few specials a week because they're very dedicated to their series, American Masters, American Experience, etc. But when we submitted it to them, they have 3 programmers. They sit and watch it together, and the only way that they will put a special on the air is if all 3 of them agree. And in our case, 2 of them loved the film, and the third one said it's too Christian, and we can't put it on the air because it's too Christian. Now, none of them called and talked to me. None of them asked me anything about my own faith journey. But nonetheless, that was their decision. The same exact week that happened, I screened the film at the C.S. Lewis Festival in northern Michigan. There were probably 200, 250 people in the audience. And when the film was done, 4 people stood up and said, "This is the most anti-Christian film I've ever seen." And they left the room. And so I figured we must have done something right. And I think when you get a chance to see it, what you'll find is that our society is divided in a lot of ways, as we know. But one of the things that we don't do enough of is just talk about faith and the journey and how people come to the conclusions that they come to, what rituals they practice, why they practice them. And as a filmmaker, I'm sort of innately curious and dive into cultures all around the world. And the faith part of life, to me, is one of the most fascinating. Had the people at PBS called me and asked me, I would have said, what's driven me for 30 years of work that's included a lot of spiritual films is I'm a seeker. I haven't found any conclusion. So Lewis's journey is fascinating to me. I'm invited to speak about Lewis all over the world and have really enjoyed it. But I find that it's much easier for me to talk about his faith journey than it is about my own, because I get lost in my own journey way too easily. At any rate, the compelling force behind this was the friendship between the 2 men. And then the fact that Lewis held this night up as the night of his conversion. It might remind many people of, being back in the dorms at Madison or wherever you went to college and sitting up into the wee hours with your friends and talking about big philosophical or theological discussions. I think we've all had those moments. This was Lewis's. Now, he did go on to say that while Dyson and Tolkien convinced him that Christianity was true and what he then called the true myth for the rest of his life, he didn't feel it in his heart at the time. He just believed it to be intellectually right. And if you read Surprised by Joy, his biography, he talks about an epiphany that he had a few months later where he was driving to the zoo and he was sitting in the sidecar of a motorcycle driven by his brother. And he talks about, and we share this in the film, but he talks about having an epiphany where he compares it to waking up and recognizing that you've been asleep and now you're awake, but you don't know why. And suddenly for him, he felt faith on this ride to the zoo in the motorcycle and didn't know why. So he never was able to really describe it. One of the people in the film who you might find particularly interesting is Dr. John Polkinghorne, who's a physicist that worked alongside Stephen Hawking for years at Cambridge. And he describes scientists as having to have that same feeling or make that same leap of faith. So there's a lot to digest here. The film will be on public television nationwide this fall. Despite the fact that PBS, the network, turned it down, American Public Television, which is their syndication service, picked it up, and it will be on. We've already gotten clearance in about 85% of the country. The only market I'm personally familiar with that I know hasn't picked it up yet is Madison. So you're welcome to call. You're welcome to call your local affiliate and say, hey, by the way, would you like to air this show? By the way, and Dennis Driesing, my friend, is sitting here. He was witness to this. But when we did the series on the Reagan presidency, we cleared over 90% of the country with that film, but it never aired in Madison. And this one, Milwaukee had not signed up for it initially, and I called them and they said, oh, it's just an oversight. We'd love to put it on. So it will air in the Milwaukee market, and I would guess there's nothing terribly controversial about it, so I would guess it will air in Madison. But it has been already picked up by all of the major stations in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, really pretty much every place else outside of Madison will be seeing it. So I would say just call WHA and ask them to put it on. So anybody have any questions? I'm happy to talk about either author. Or I can talk about the business of public television.
We're coming, Stu. Just wait. Wait, Stu, wait. Wait.
I can repeat it for you. I heard it.
You asked the question. You raised the issue of the relationship between myth and ritual and witness of privacy in people's belief system. Could you discuss that a little bit more?
Yeah, I would say the person in our film who discusses it in detail is Reza Aslan, and he's obviously a much greater expert than I am at discussing it. But the question that's posed, and it was initially posed by Lewis, was which came first? Because ritual a lot of times just grows out of our cultural experiences. It grows out of our ethnicity, what we eat, what we do to recreate. And so in the film, Reza poses the question and talks about Catholic ritual in particular and transubstantiation and why it becomes important to metaphorically eat the body of Christ. And so whether that came first, if you're a fan of Zoroastrianism, you might say, well, that did come first. The ritual may have come first. But that's the question that's posed there. And I would say when you watch the film, Reza is the one who does the best job of talking about it, especially in the context of Passover. I'm not an expert on Passover, but he is and talks about it in detail and says which came first, Exodus ritual or Passover or Exodus ritual. So another question.
I have a question regarding the take-home message of this film. Mm-hmm. We're living in the 21st century, and a century of disaster, wars, men killing each other. What do you say this film would be saying to a 21st century man regarding spirituality and the idea that man goes beyond nature, when we have so many people in the world wanting to kill each other? I mean, how do you reconcile this film with the reality of a very, very, I think, murderous world?
Well, I don't think the film is going to solve that problem in any way whatsoever. But what I do think the film does, and I think the reason that I think it will be successful on public television, is it engages the life of the mind and takes us out of the world of politics long enough for each of us individually to consider our faith or our lack of faith, whatever that may be. And I think the film does a good job of that. For me, it's refreshing, because we've done so much work in the political and historical area. It's refreshing to actually work on something that isn't about that. So if someone comes to this film without having any of their own perception of faith, I would think that they would at least be inclined to dig much deeper into these two authors, but potentially into everything from Jewish writings to Sanskrit to whatever might appeal to their imaginative process. The film does have a little bit of a bent towards the Nordic Celtic kind of mythology, and that's just because that's what primarily informed Lewis and Tolkien. But there's no particular judgment in the film of any kind. It's really more of an exploration. If anything, I hope people will come away from it asking themselves questions that they then decide to pick up a book and go answer. The only, in terms of war, the only other thing that I will say is there is a section in the film that deals with World War I, and that's because both Lewis and Tolkien were soldiers in World War I. And it did there's no question that World War I informed their literature. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is, essentially pulled right out of Lewis's journey in World War I. And I think anybody who's a fan of The Lord of the Rings has probably explored and experienced a lot of World War I in that trilogy. I shouldn't call it a trilogy. Technically, it's a novel.
Sorry, one question.
Over here.
Hi. Sorry, just two things. One thing is you may not know that Madison has hosted for, I think, a couple decades a live action recreation of the Lord of the Rings War. So Governor Dodge State Park in the fall.
Yeah.
But second, spoiler alert, I mean, are you allowed to say how Lewis was convinced? Is it clearly articulated in the film?
The only thing he says, and I think much of the film really is speculation, because Lewis is the only one that wrote about it. But the only thing he really says is that he felt that Tolkien and Dyson presented history and the history of Christ in such a way that he couldn't deny the facts, but they presented it in the context of the fundamentals of any other mythology that he had known and loved over time. Now, that's where the film gets into the big questions, which is it certainly didn't resolve the resurrection. I mean, that is not, by some people's standards, they might think it's historical fact, other people may not. And so he didn't deal with that. He didn't write about it in the context of this particular evening. But what he did say was he believed that they presented him with a case in history that confirmed and allowed him to explore the mythological elements that combined with history to convince him that Christianity was true as a myth. For Lewis and Tolkien, I would say myth wins out over ritual.
Lewis talks about imagination as the organ of meaning. Could you talk about that? What does that mean to us? What does that mean in this context?
Well, the quote that you're referring to, I think, is a Chesterton quote that they lifted, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure I can actually answer that question either, not in an informed way. The quote appears in the film, and I think it's attributed to Chesterton in the film. So I'm sorry, I can't.
C.S. Lewis thinks imagination is important. We don't think imagination is particularly important today. There's just facts, there's different things.
Well, and I would hope, and this might go back to the question from the gentleman in the back, that we delve into and explain the imaginative process in a way that might encourage people to tap into it. Not just creativity, but how does something come about? How does something exist that did not exist previously? And I'll get back to you, but I'm pretty sure it's a Chesterton quote. The last thing I wanted to say, because I know I have to wrap up, is that in addition to filmmaking, I'm also an author, and this is my new book, and I'll be lucky to sell about 8,000 to 10,000 copies of this, especially if some of you buy it. But by comparison, Tolkien sold 150 million copies of Lord of the Rings, so it's very humbling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chip. We hope to see it in Madison, so we will keep our fingers crossed. Have a great afternoon. Go out and wear out your maps. Have a great day.